After a long examination, Captain Len Guy had to renounce the hope of finding a passage through the terrible wall of ice. It remained only to endeavor to reach the southeast point of it. At any rate, by following that course, we lost nothing in latitude. And in fact, on the 18th the observation taken made the 73rd parallel the position of the Halbrane. I must repeat, however, that navigation in the Antarctic seas will probably never be accomplished under more felicitous circumstances. The precocity of the summer season, the permanence of the north wind, the temperature 49 degrees at the lowest, all this was the best of good fortune. I need not add that we enjoyed perpetual light, and the whole 24 hours round the sun's rays reached us from every point of the horizon. 2 or 3 times, the captain approached within 2 miles of the icebergs. It was impossible, but that the vast mass must have been subjected to climateric influences. Ruptures must surely have taken place at some points. But his search had no result, and we had to fall back into the current from west to east. I must observe at this point that during all our search we never descried land or the appearance of land out at sea, as indicated on the charts of preceding navigators. These maps are incomplete, no doubt, but sufficiently exact in their main lines. I am aware that ships have often passed over the indicated bearings of land. This, however, was not admissible in the case of Tsalo. If the Jane had been able to reach the islands, it was because that portion of the Antarctic Sea was free, and in so early a year, we need not fear any obstacle in that direction. At last, on the 19th, between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a shout from the crow's nest was heard. "What is it?" roared West. "The iceberg wall is split on the southeast." "What is beyond?" "Nothing in sight." It took West very little time to reach the point of observation, and we all waited below, how impatiently may be imagined. What if the lookout were mistaken, if some optical delusion? But West, at all events, would make no mistake. After 10 interminable minutes, his clear voice reached us on the deck. "Open sea," he cried. Unanimous cheers made answer. The schooner's head was put to the southeast, hugging the wind as much as possible. 2 hours later we had doubled the extremity of the ice barrier, and there lay before our eyes a sparkling sea, entirely open. Chapter 14. A Voice in a Dream. Entirely free from ice? No, it would have been premature to affirm this as a fact. A few icebergs were visible in the distance, while some drifts and packs were still going east. Nevertheless, the breakup had been very thorough on that side, and the sea was in reality open, since a ship could sail freely. "God has come to our aid," said Captain Len Guy. "May he be pleased to guide us to the end." In a week, I remarked, our schooner might come in sight of Tsalo Island. "Provided that the east wind lasts, Mr. Georling. Don't forget that in sailing along the icebergs to their eastern extremity, the Halbrane went out of her course, and she must be brought back towards the west. The breeze is for us, Captain. And we shall profit by it, for my intention is to make for Bennet Islet. It was there that my brother first landed, and so soon as we shall have sighted that island we shall be certain that we are on the right route. Today, when I have ascertained our position exactly, we shall steer for Bennet Islet. Who knows but that we may come upon some fresh sign? It is not impossible, Mr. Georling. I need not say that recourse was had to the surest guide within our reach, that voracious narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which I read and reread with intense attention, fascinated as I was by the idea that I might be permitted to behold with my own eyes those strange phenomena of nature in the Antarctic world, which I, in common with all Edgar Poe's readers, had hitherto regarded as creations of the most imaginative writer who ever gave voice by his pen to the fantasies of a unique brain. No doubt, a great part of the wonders of Arthur Gordon Pym's narrative would prove pure fiction, but if even a little of the marvelous story were found to be true, how great a privilege would be mine. The picturesque and wonderful side of the story we were studying as gospel truth had little charm and but slight interest for Captain Len Guy. He was indifferent to everything in Pym's narrative that did not relate directly to the castaways of Tsalo Island. His mind was solely and constantly set upon their rescue. According to the narrative of Arthur Pym, the Jane experienced serious difficulties, due to bad weather, from the 1st to the 4th of January, 1828. It was not until the morning of the 5th, in latitude 73 degrees 15 letter 2b9, that she found a free passage through the last iceberg that barred her way. The final difference between our position and the Jane in a parallel case was that the Jane took 15 days to accomplish the distance of 10 degrees, or 600 miles, which separated her on the 5th of January from Sowell Island, while on the 19th of December the Halbrane was only about 7 degrees, or 400 miles, off the island. Bennet Islet, where Captain Guy intended to put in for 24 hours, was 50 miles nearer. Our voyage was progressing under prosperous conditions. We were no longer visited by sudden hail and snowstorms, or those rapid falls of temperature which tried the crew of the Jane so sorely. A few ice floes drifted by us, occasionally peopled, as tourists throng a pleasure yacht, by penguins, and also by dusky seals, lying flat upon the white surfaces like enormous leeches. Above this strange flotilla we traced the incessant flight of petrels, pigeons, black puffins, divers, grebe, sterns, cormorants, and the sooty black albatross of the high latitudes. Huge metis exquisitely tinted, floated on the water like spread parasols. Among the denizens of the deep, captured by the crew of the schooner with line and net, I noted more particularly a sort of giant John Dory, one dorade 3 feet in length, with firm and savory flesh. During the night, or rather what ought to have been the night of the 19th-20th, my sleep was disturbed by a strange dream. Yes, there could be no doubt but that it was only a dream. Nevertheless, I think it well to record it here, because it is an additional testimony to the haunting influence under which my brain was beginning to labor. I was sleeping at 2 hours after midnight and was awakened by a plaintive and continuous murmuring sound. I opened, or I imagined I opened my eyes. My cabin was in profound darkness. The murmur began again. I listened, and it seemed to me that a voice which I did not know, whispered these words. Pims, poor Pim. Evidently this could only be a delusion. Unless, indeed, someone had got into my cabin, the door was not locked. Pim, the voice repeated, poor Pim must never be forgot. This time the words were spoken close to my ear. What was the meaning of the injunction, and why was it addressed to me? And besides, had not Pim, after his return to America, met with a sudden and deplorable death, the circumstances or the details being unknown? I began to doubt whether I was in my right mind, and shook myself into complete wakefulness, recognizing that I had been disturbed by an extremely vivid dream due to some cerebral cause. I turned out of my berth and, pushing back the shutter, looked out of my cabin. No one aft on the deck except Hunt, who was at the helm. I had nothing to do but to lie down again, and this I did. It seemed to me that the name of Arthur Pym was repeated in my hearing several times. Nevertheless, I fell asleep and did not wake until morning, when I retained only a vague impression of this occurrence, which soon faded away. No other incident at that period of our voyage calls for notice. Nothing particular occurred on board our schooner. The breeze from the north, which had forsaken us, did not recur, and only the current carried the Halbrane towards the south. This caused a delay unbearable to our impatience. At last, on the 21st, the usual observation gave 82 degrees 50 letter 2b9 of latitude and degrees 20 letter 2b9 of west longitude. Bennet Islet, if it had any existence, could not be far off now. Yes, the islet did exist, and its bearings were those indicated by Arthur Pym. At 6 o'clock in the evening, one of the crew cried out that there was land ahead on the port side. Chapter 15. Bennet Islet. The Halbrane was then within sight of Bennet Islet. The crew urgently needed rest, so the disembarkation was deferred until the following day, and I went back to my cabin. The night passed without disturbance, and when day came not a craft of any kind was visible on the waters, not a native on the beach. There were no huts upon the coast, no smoke arose in the distance to indicate that Bennet Islet was inhabited. But William Guy had not found any trace of human beings there, and what I saw of the islet answered to the description given by Arthur Pym. It rose upon a rocky base of about a league in circumference, and was so arid that no vegetation existed on its surface. "Mr. Georling," said Captain Len Guy, "do you observe a promontory in the direction of the northeast?" "I observe it, Captain." "Is it not formed of heaped-up rocks, which look like giant bales of cotton?" "That is so, and just what the narrative describes." "Then all we have to do is to land on the promontory, Mr. Georling. Who knows, but we may come across some vestige of the crew of the Jane, supposing them to have succeeded in escaping from Sallel Island. The speaker was devouring the islet with his eyes. What must his thoughts, his desires, his impatience have been? But there was a man whose gaze was set upon the same point even more fixedly. That man was Hunt. Before we left the Halbrane, Len Guy enjoined the most minute and careful watchfulness upon his lieutenant. This was a charge which West did not need. Our exploration would take only half a day at most. If the boat had not returned in the afternoon, a second was to be sent in search of us. Look sharp also after our recruits, added the captain. Don't be uneasy, Captain, replied the lieutenant. Indeed, since you want 4 men at the oars, you had better take them from among the new ones. That will leave 4 less troublesome fellows on board. This was a good idea, for under the deplorable influence of Hearne, the discontent of his shipmates from the Falklands was on the increase. The boat being ready, 4 of the new crew took their places forward, while Hunt, at his own request, was steersman. Captain Len Guy, the boatswain and myself, all well armed, seated ourselves aft, and we started for the northern point of the islet. In the course of an hour we had doubled the promontory, and come in sight of the little bay whose shores the boats of the Jane had touched. Hunt steered for this bay, gliding with remarkable skill between the rocky points which stuck up here and there. One would have thought he knew his way among them. We disembarked on a stony coast. The stones were covered with sparse lichen. The tide was already ebbing, leaving uncovered the sandy bottom of a sort of beach strewn with black blocks, resembling big nail heads. 2 men were left in charge of the boat while we landed amid the rocks, and accompanied by the other 2, Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, Hunt and I proceeded towards the center, where we found some rising ground, from whence we could see the whole extent of the islet. But there was nothing to be seen on any side, absolutely nothing. On coming down from the slight eminence, Hunt went on in front, as it had been agreed that he was to be our guide. We followed him therefore, as he led us towards the southern extremity of the islet. Having reached the point, Hunt looked carefully on all sides of him, then stooped and showed us a piece of half-rotten wood lying among the scattered stones. I remember, I exclaimed. Arthur Pym speaks of a piece of wood with traces of carving on it which appeared to have belonged to the bow of a ship. Among the carving, my brother fancied he could trace the design of a tortoise, added Captain Len Guy. Just so, I replied, but Arthur Pym pronounced that resemblance doubtful. No matter, the piece of wood is still in the same place that is indicated in the narrative, so we may conclude that since the Jane cast anchor here no other crew has ever set foot upon Bennet Islet. It follows that we should only lose time in looking out for any tokens of another landing. We shall know nothing until we reached Sallel Island. Yes, Sallel Island, replied the captain. We then retraced our steps in the direction of the bay. In various places, we observed fragments of coral reef, and bêche de mer was so abundant that our schooner might have taken a full cargo of it. Hunt walked on in silence with downcast eyes, until as we were close upon the beach to the east, he, being about 10 paces ahead, stopped abruptly and summoned us to him by a hurried gesture. In an instant we were by his side. Hunt had evinced no surprise on the subject of the piece of wood first found, but his attitude changed when he knelt down in front of a worm-eaten plank lying on the sand. He felt it all over with his huge hands, as though he were seeking some tracery on its rough surface, whose signification might be intelligible to him. The black paint was hidden under the thick dirt that had accumulated upon it. The plank had probably formed part of a ship's stern, as the boatswain requested us to observe. Yes, yes, repeated Captain Len Guy, it made part of a stern. Hunt, who still remained kneeling, nodded his big head in assent. But, I remarked, this plank must have been cast upon Bennet Islet from a wreck. The cross-currents must have found it in the open sea, and— If that were so, cried the captain. The same thought had occurred to both of us. What was our surprise, indeed our amazement, our unspeakable emotion, when Hunt showed us 8 letters cut in the plank, not painted, but hollow and distinctly traceable with the finger. It was only too easy to recognize the letters of 2 names, arranged in 2 lines thus. And Chapter 51, E.Po. L. The Jane of Liverpool, the schooner commanded by Captain William Guy. What did it matter that time had blurred the other letters? Did not those suffice to tell the name of the ship and the port she belonged to? the Jane of Liverpool. Captain Len Guy had taken the plank in his hands, and now he pressed his lips to it, while tears fell from his eyes. It was a fragment of the Jane. I did not utter a word until the captain's emotion had subsided. As for Hunt, I had never seen such a lightning glance from his brilliant hawk-like eyes as he now cast towards the southern horizon. Captain Len Guy rose. Hunt, without a word, placed the plank upon his shoulder, and we continued our route. When we had made the tour of the island, we halted at the place where the boat had been left under the charge of 2 sailors, and about 2:30 in the afternoon, we were again on board. Early on the morning of the 23rd of December, the Halbrane put off from Bennet Islet, and we carried away with us new and convincing testimony to the catastrophe which Sallel Island had witnessed. During that day, I observed the sea water very attentively, and it seemed to me less deeply blue than Arthur Pym describes it. Nor had we met a single specimen of his monster of the austral fauna, an animal 3 feet long, 6 inches high, with 4 short legs, long coral claws, a silky body, a rat's tail, a cat's head, the hanging ears, blood-red lips, and white teeth of a dog. The truth is that I regarded several of these details as suspect, and entirely due to an over-imaginative temperament. Seated far aft in the ship, I read Edgar Poe's book with sedulous attention, but I was not unaware of the fact that Hunt, whenever his duties furnished him with an opportunity, observed me pertinaciously and with looks of singular meaning. And in fact, I was reperusing the end of chapter Romans 17, in which Arthur Pym acknowledged his responsibility for the sad and tragic events which were the results of his advice. It was, in fact, he who overpersuaded Captain William Guy, urging him to profit by so tempting an opportunity of solving the great problem relating to the Antarctic continent. And besides, while accepting that responsibility, did he not congratulate himself on having been the instrument of a great discovery, and having aided in some degree to reveal to science one of the most marvelous secrets which had ever claimed its attention? At 6 o'clock, the sun disappeared behind a thick curtain of mist. After midnight the breeze freshened, and the Halbrane's progress marked a dozen additional miles. On the morrow the good ship was less than the third of a degree, that is to say less than 20 miles, from Sallel Island. Unfortunately, just after midday the wind fell. Nevertheless, thanks to the current, the island of Sallel was signaled at 45 minutes past 6 in the evening. The anchor was cast, a watch was set, with loaded firearms within hand-reach and boarding nets ready. The Halbrane ran no risk of being surprised. Too many eyes were watching on board, especially those of Hunt, whose gaze never quitted the horizon of that southern zone for an instant. Chapter 16. Sallel Island. The night passed without alarm. No boat had put off from the island, nor had a native shown himself upon the beach. The Halbrane, then, had not been observed on her arrival. This was all the better. We had cast anchor in 10 fathoms, at 3 miles from the coast. When the Jane appeared in these waters, the people of Sallel beheld a ship for the first time, and they took it for an enormous animal, regarding its masts as limbs and its sails as garments. Now, they ought to be better informed on this subject, and if they did not attempt to visit us, to what motive were we to assign such conduct? Captain Len Guy gave orders for the lowering of the ship's largest boat, in a voice which betrayed his impatience. The order was executed, and the captain, addressing West, said, "Send 8 men down with Martin Holt, send Hunt to the helm, remain yourself at the moorings, and keep a lookout landwards as well as to sea." "Aye, aye, sir, don't be uneasy. We are going ashore, and we shall try to gain the village of Clock. If any difficulty should arise on sea, give us warning by firing 3 shots." "All right," replied West, at a minute's interval. "If we should not return before evening, send the second boat with 10 armed men under the boatswain's orders, and let them station themselves within a cable's length of the shore, so as to escort us back. You understand?" "Perfectly, Captain." "If we are not to be found, after you have done all in your power, you will take command of the schooner and bring her back to the Falklands." "I will do so." The large boat was rapidly got ready. 8 men embarked in it, including Martin Holt and Hunt, all armed with rifles, pistols, and knives. The latter weapons were slung in their belts. They also carried cartridge pouches. I stepped forward and said, Will you not allow me to accompany you, Captain? If you wish to do so, Mr. Georling. I went to my cabin, took my gun, a repeating rifle with ball and powder, and rejoined Captain Len Guy, who had kept a place in the stern of the boat for me. Our object was to discover the passage through which Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters had crossed the reef on the 19th of January, 1828, in the Jane's boat. For 20 minutes we rowed along the reef, and then Hunt discovered the pass, which was through a narrow cut in the rocks. Leaving 2 men in the boat, we landed, and having gone through the winding gorge which gave access to the crest of the coast, our little force, headed by Hunt, pushed on towards the center of the island. Captain Len Guy and myself exchanged observations, as we walked, on the subject of this country, which, as Arthur Pym declared, differed essentially from every other land hitherto visited by human beings. We soon found that Pym's description was trustworthy. The general color of the plains was black, as though the clay were made of lava dust. Nowhere was anything white to be seen. At 100 paces distance, Hunt began to run towards an enormous mass of rock, climbed on it with great agility, and looked out over a wide extent of space like a man who ought to recognize the place he is in, but does not. "What is the matter with him?" asked Captain Len Guy, who was observing Hunt attentively. "I don't know what is the matter with him, Captain. But as you are aware, everything about this man is odd. His ways are inexplicable, and on certain sides of him, he seems to belong to those strange beings whom Arthur Pym asserts that he found on this island. One would even say that." "That," repeated the captain. And then, without finishing my sentence, I said, "Captain, are you sure that you made a good observation when you took the altitude yesterday?" "Certainly." "So that your point gave 83 degrees 20 letter 2b9 of latitude and degrees 5 letter 2b9 of longitude?" "Exactly." "Exactly. There is, then, no doubt that we are on Sallel Island?" "None, Mr. Georling, if Sallel Island lies where Arthur Pym places it." This was quite true, there could be no doubt on the point, and yet of all that Arthur Pym described nothing existed, or rather nothing was any longer to be seen. Not a tree, not a shrub, not a plant was visible in the landscape. There was no sign of the wooded hills between which the village of Clock Clock ought to lie, or of the streams from which the crew of the Jane had not ventured to drink. There was no water anywhere, but everywhere absolute, awful drought. Nevertheless, Hunt walked on rapidly without showing any hesitation. It seemed as though he was led by a natural instinct, a bee's flight, as we say in America. I know not what presentiment induced us to follow him as the best of guides, a Chingachgook, a Renard Subtil. And why not? Was not he the fellow countryman of Fenimore Cooper's heroes? But I must repeat that we had not before our eyes that fabulous land which Arthur Pym described. The soil we were treading had been ravaged, wrecked, torn by convulsion. It was black, a cindery black, as though it had been vomited from the earth under the action of Plutonian forces. It suggested that some appalling and irresistible cataclysm had overturned the whole of its surface. Not one of the animals mentioned in the narrative was to be seen, and even the penguins which abound in the Antarctic regions had fled from this uninhabitable land. Its stern silence and solitude made it a hideous desert. No human being was to be seen either on the coast or in the interior. Did any chance of finding William Guy and the survivors of the Jane exist in the midst of this scene of desolation? I looked at Captain Len Guy. His pale face, dim eyes, and knit brow told too plainly that hope was beginning to die within his breast. And then the population of Sallel Island, the almost naked men armed with clubs and lances, the tall, well-made, upstanding women, endowed with grace and freedom of bearing not to be found in a civilized society. Those are the expressions of Arthur Pym. And the crowd of children accompanying them, what had become of all these? Where were the multitude of natives with black skins, black hair, black teeth, who regarded white color with deadly terror? All of a sudden a light flashed upon me. "An earthquake!" I exclaimed. Yes, 2 or 3 of those terrible shocks, so common in these regions where the sea penetrates by infiltration, and a day comes when the quantity of accumulated vapor makes its way out and destroys everything on the surface. Could an earthquake have changed Sallel Island to such an extent? Asked Len Guy, musingly. Yes, Captain, an earthquake has done this thing. It has destroyed every trace of all that Arthur Pym saw here. Hunt, who had drawn nigh to us, and was listening, nodded his head in approval of my words. Are not these countries of the southern seas volcanic? I resumed. If the Halbrane were to transport us to Victoria Land, we might find the Erebus and the Terror in the midst of an eruption. And yet, observed Martin Holt, if there had been an eruption here, we should find lava beds. I do not say that there has been an eruption, I replied, but I do say the soil has been convulsed by an earthquake. On reflection, it will be seen that the explanation given by me deserved to be admitted. And then it came to my remembrance that according to Arthur Pym's narrative, Tsalal belonged to a group of islands which extended towards the west. Unless the people of Tsalal had been destroyed, it was possible that they might have fled into one of the neighboring islands. We should do well, then, to go and reconnoiter that archipelago, for Tsalal clearly had no resources whatever to offer after the cataclysm. I spoke of this to the captain. Yes, he replied, and tears stood in his eyes. Yes, it may be so. And yet, how could my brother and his unfortunate companions have found the means of escaping? Is it not far more probable that they all perished in the earthquake? Here Hunt made us a signal to follow him, and we did so. After he had pushed across the valley for a considerable distance, he stopped. What a spectacle was before our eyes! There, lying in heaps, were human bones, all the fragments of that framework of humanity which we call the skeleton, hundreds of them without a particle of flesh, clusters of skulls still bearing some tufts of hair, a vast bone heap dried and whitened in this place. We were struck dumb and motionless by this spectacle. When Captain Len Guy could speak, he murmured, "My brothers, my poor brother." On a little reflection, however, my mind refused to admit certain things. How was this catastrophe to be reconciled with Patterson's memoranda? The entries in his notebook stated explicitly that the mate of the Jane had left his companions on Tsalal Island 7 months previously. They could not then have perished in this earthquake, for the state of the bones proved that it had taken place several years earlier and must have occurred after the departure of Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters, since no mention of it was made in the narrative of the former. These facts were, then, irreconcilable. If the earthquake was of recent date, the presence of those time-bleached skeletons could not be attributed to its action. In any case, the survivors of the Jane were not among them. But then, where were they? The valley of Clock Clock extended no farther. We had to retrace our steps in order to regain the coast. We had hardly gone half a mile on the cliff's edge when Hunt again stopped, on perceiving some fragments of bones which were turning to dust, and did not seem to be those of a human being. Were these the remains of one of the strange animals described by Arthur Pym, of which we had not hitherto seen any specimens? Hunt suddenly uttered a cry, or rather a sort of savage growl, and held out his enormous hand, holding a metal collar. Yes, a brass collar, a collar eaten by rust but bearing letters which might still be deciphered. These letters formed the 3 following words. Tiger Arthur Pym. Tiger, the name of the dog which had saved Arthur Pym's life in the hold of the Grampus, and during the revolt of the crew, had sprung at the throat of Jones, the sailor, who was immediately finished by Dirk Peters. Hunt extended his enormous hand, holding a metal collar. Hunt extended his enormous hand, holding a metal collar. So then, that faithful animal had not perished in the shipwreck of the Grampus. He had been taken on board the Jane at the same time as Arthur Pym and the half-breed. And yet the narrative did not allude to this, and after the meeting with the schooner, there was no longer any mention of the dog. All these contradictions occurred to me. I could not reconcile the facts. Nevertheless, there could be no doubt that Tiger had been saved from the shipwreck like Arthur Pym, had escaped the landslip of the Clock Clock Hill, and had come to his death at last in the catastrophe which had destroyed a portion of the population of Tsalal. But again, William Guy and his 5 sailors could not be among those skeletons which were strewn upon the earth, since they were living at the time of Patterson's departure, 7 months ago, and the catastrophe already dated several years back. 3 hours later, we had returned on board the Halbrane without having made any other discovery. Captain Len Guy went direct to his cabin, shut himself up there, and did not reappear even at dinner hour. The following day, as I wished to return to the island in order to resume its exploration from one coast to the other, I requested West to have me rowed ashore. He consented, after he had been authorized by Captain Len Guy, who did not come with us. Hunt, the boatswain, Martin Holt, 4 men, and myself took our places in the boat, without arms, for there was no longer anything to fear. We disembarked at our yesterday's landing place, and Hunt again led the way towards the hill of Clock Clock. Nothing remained of the eminence that had been carried away in the artificial landslip, from which the captain of the Jane, Patterson, his second officer, and 5 of his men had happily escaped. The village of Clock Clock had thus disappeared, and doubtless the mystery of the strange discoveries narrated in Edgar Poe's work was now and ever would remain beyond solution. We had only to regain our ship, returning by the east side of the coast. Hunt brought us through the space where sheds had been erected for the preparation of the bêche de mer, and we saw the remains of them. On all sides, silence and abandonment reigned. We made a brief pause at the place where Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters seized upon the boat which bore them towards higher latitudes, even to that horizon of dark vapor, whose rents permitted them to discern the huge human figure, the white giant. Hunt stood with crossed arms, his eyes devouring the vast extent of the sea. "Well, Hunt," said I tentatively. Hunt did not appear to hear me. He did not turn his head in my direction. "What are we doing here?" I asked him and touched him on the shoulder. He started and cast a glance upon me which went to my heart. "Come along, Hunt," cried her eagerly. "Are you going to take root on this rock? Don't you see the Halbrane waiting for us at her moorings? Come along, we shall be off tomorrow. There is nothing more to do here." It seemed to me that Hunt's trembling lips repeated the word, "nothing," while his whole bearing protested against what the boatswain said. The boat brought us back to the ship. Captain Len Guy had not left his cabin. West, having received no orders, was pacing the deck aft. I seated myself at the foot of the mainmast, observing the sea which lay open and free before us. At this moment the captain came on deck. He was very pale, and his features looked pinched and weary. "Mr. Jeorling," said he, "I can affirm conscientiously that I have done all it was possible to do. Can I hope henceforth that my brother William and his companions— No, no, we must go away before winter." He drew himself up, and cast a last glance towards Sallow Island. "Tomorrow, Jim," he said to West, "tomorrow we will make sail as early as possible." At this moment, a rough voice uttered the words, "And Pym, poor Pym." I recognized this voice. It was the voice I had heard in my dream. Chapter 17. And Pym. And Pym, poor Pym. I turned round quickly. Hunt had spoken. This strange person was standing motionless at a little distance, gazing fixedly at the horizon. It was so unusual to hear Hunt's voice on board the schooner, that the men, whom the unaccustomed sound reached, drew near, moved by curiosity. Did not his unexpected intervention point to, I had a presentiment that it did, some wonderful revelation? A movement of West's hand sent the men forward, leaving only the mate, the boatswain, Martin Holt, the sailing master, and Hardy, with the captain and myself in the vicinity of Hunt. The captain approached and addressed him. "What did you say?" I said, "And Pym, poor Pym." "Well then, what do you mean by repeating the name of the man whose pernicious advice led my brother to the island on which the Jane was lost? The greater part of her crew was massacred, and where we have not found even one left of those who were still here 7 months ago." Hunt did not speak. "Answer, I say, answer," cried the captain. Hunt hesitated, not because he did not know what to say, but from a certain difficulty in expressing his ideas. The latter were quite clear, but his speech was confused, his words were unconnected. He had a certain language of his own which sometimes was picturesque, and his pronunciation was strongly marked by the hoarse accent of the Indians of the far west. "You see," he said, "I do not know how to tell things, my tongue stops. Understand me, I spoke of Pym, poor Pym, did I not?" "Yes," answered West sternly, "and what have you to say about Arthur Pym?" "I have to say that he must not be abandoned." "Abandoned," I exclaimed. "No, never, it would be cruel, too cruel. We must go to seek him." "To seek him," repeated Captain Len Guy. "Understand me, it is for this that I have embarked on the Halbrane, yes, to find poor Pym." "And where is he?" I asked, "if not deep in a grave in the cemetery of his natal city?" "No, he is in the place where he remained, alone, all alone," continued Hunt, pointing towards the south, and since then the sun has risen on that horizon 7 times. It was evident that Hunt intended to designate the Antarctic regions, but what did he mean by this? "Do you not know that Arthur Pym is dead?" said the captain. "Dead," replied Hunt, emphasizing the word with an expressive gesture. "No, listen to me. I know things understand me. He is not dead." "Come now, Hunt," said I. "Remember what you do know. In the last chapter of The Adventures of Arthur Pym, does not Edgar Poe relate his sudden and deplorable end?" "Explain yourself, Hunt," said the captain in a tone of command. "Reflect, take your time, and say plainly whatever you have to say." And while Hunt passed his hand over his brow, as though to collect his memory of far-off things, I observed to Captain Len Guy, "There is something very singular in the intervention of this man, if indeed he be not mad." At my words the boatswain shook his head, for he did not believe Hunt to be in his right mind. The latter understood this shake of the boatswain's head, and cried out in a harsh tone, "No, not mad, and madmen are respected on the prairies even if they are not believed, and I must be believed. No, 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 Pym is not dead." "Edgar Poe asserts that he is," I replied. "Yes, I know, Edgar Poe of Baltimore, but he never saw poor Pym, never, never." "What?" exclaimed Captain Len Guy. "The two men were not acquainted?" "No." "And it was not Arthur Pym himself who related his adventures to Edgar Poe?" "No, Captain, no. He, below there at Baltimore, had only the notes written by Pym from the day when he hid himself on board the Grampus to the very last hour. The last, understand me, the last." "Who then brought back that journal?" asked Captain Len Guy as he seized Hunt's hand. "It was Pym's companion, he who loved him, his poor Pym like a son. It was Dirk Peters, the half-breed, who came back alone from there beyond." "The half-breed Dirk Peters," I exclaimed. "Yes. Alone. Alone. And Arthur Pym may be." "There," answered Hunt, in a loud voice, bending towards the southern line, from which he had not diverted his gaze for a moment. Could such an assertion prevail against the general incredulity? No, assuredly not. Martin Holt nudged her eagerly with his elbow, and both regarded Hunt with pity, while West observed him without speaking. Captain Len Guy made me a sign, meaning that nothing serious was to be got out of this poor fellow, whose mental faculties must have been out of gear for a long time. And nevertheless, when I looked keenly at Hunt, it seemed to me that a sort of radiance of truth shone out of his eyes. Then I set to work to interrogate the man, putting to him precise and pressing questions which he tried to answer categorically, as we shall see, and not once did he contradict himself. "Tell me," I asked, "did Arthur Pym really come to Tsalal Island on board the Grampus?" "Yes." "Did Arthur Pym separate himself, with the half-breed and one of the sailors, from his companions, while Captain William Guy had gone to the village of Clock Clock?" "Yes, the sailor was one Allen, and he was almost immediately stifled under the stones. Then the two others saw the attack, and the destruction of the schooner from the top of the hill." "Yes." "Then, some time later, the two left the island, after they had got possession of one of the boats which the natives could not take from them." "Yes." "And after 20 days, having reached the front of the curtain of vapor, they were both carried down into the Gulf of the Cataract." This time Hunt did not reply in the affirmative. He hesitated, he stammered out some vague words. He seemed to be trying to rekindle the half-extinguished flame of his memory. At length, looking at me and shaking his head, he answered, "No, not both. Understand me, Dirk never told me." "Dirk Peters," interposed Captain Len Guy quickly. "You knew Dirk Peters?" "Yes." "Where?" "At Vandalia, state of Illinois." "And it is from him that you have all this information concerning the voyage?" "From him." "And he came back alone, alone from that voyage, having left Arthur Pym?" "Alone." "Speak, man, do speak," I cried impatiently. Then, in broken but intelligible sentences, Hunt spoke. "Yes, there a curtain of vapor, so the half-breed often said, understand me. The two, Arthur Pym and he, were in the Tsalal boat. Then an enormous block of ice came full upon them. At the shock Dirk Peters was thrown into the sea, but he clung to the ice block, and understand me, he saw the boat drift with the current, far, very far too far. In vain did Pym try to rejoin his companion, he could not. The boat drifted on, and Pym, that poor dear Pym, was carried away. It is he who has never come back, and he is there, still there. If Hunt had been the half-breed in person, he could not have spoken with more heartfelt emotion of poor Pym. It was then, in front of the curtain of vapor, that Arthur Pym and the half-breed had been separated from each other. Dirk Peters had succeeded in returning from the ice world to America, whither he had conveyed the notes that were communicated to Edgar Poe. Hunt was minutely questioned upon all these points, and he replied, conformably, he declared, to what the half-breed had told him many times. According to this statement, Dirk Peters had Arthur Pym's notebook in his pocket at the moment when the ice block struck them, and thus the journal which the half-breed placed at the disposal of the American romance writer was saved. Understand me, Hunt repeated, for I tell you things as I have them from Dirk Peters. While the drift was carrying him away, he cried out with all his strength. Pym, poor Pym, had already disappeared in the midst of the vapor. The half-breed, feeding upon raw fish, which he contrived to catch, was carried back by a cross-current to Tsalo Island, where he landed half-dead from hunger. To Tsalo Island, exclaimed Captain Len Guy, and how long was it since they had left it? 3 weeks, yes, 3 weeks at the farthest, so Dirk Peters told me. Then he must have found all that remained of the crew of the Jane, my brother William, and those who had survived with him. No, replied Hunt, and Dirk Peters always believed that they had perished, yes, to the very last man. There was no one upon the island. No one. Not a living soul. But the population. No one, I tell you. The island was a desert, yes, a desert. This statement contradicted certain facts of which we were absolutely certain. After all, though, it was possible that when Dirk Peters returned to Tsalo Island, the population, seized by who can tell what terror, had already taken refuge upon the southwestern group, and that William Guy and his companions were still hidden in the gorges of Clock Clock. That would explain why the half-breed had not come across them, and also why the survivors of the Jane had had nothing to fear during the 11 years of their sojourn in the island. On the other hand, since Patterson had left them there 7 months previously, if we did not find them, that must have been because they had been obliged to leave Tsalo, the place being rendered uninhabitable by the earthquake. So that, resumed Captain Len Guy, on the return of Dirk Peters, there was no longer an inhabitant on the island. No one, repeated Hunt, no one. The half-breed did not meet a single native. And what did Dirk Peters do? Understand me. A forsaken boat lay there at the back of the bay, containing some dried meat and several casks of water. The half-breed got into it, and a south wind, yes, south, very strong, the same that had driven the ice block with the cross-current towards Tsalo Island, carried him on for weeks and weeks to the iceberg barrier through a passage in it. You may believe me, I am telling you only what Dirk Peters told me, and he cleared the polar circle. And beyond it, I inquired. Beyond it, he was picked up by an American whaler, the Sandy Hook, and taken back to America. Now, one thing at all events was clear. Edgar Poe had never known Arthur Pym. This was the reason why, wishing to leave his readers in exciting uncertainty, he had brought Pym to an end, as sudden as it was deplorable, but without indicating the manner or the cause of his death. And yet, although Arthur Pym did not return, could it be reasonably admitted that he had survived his companion for any length of time, that he was still living, 11 years having elapsed since his disappearance? Yes, yes, replied Hunt. And this he affirmed with the strong conviction that Dirk Peters had infused into his mind, while the two were living together in Vandalia, in Illinois. Now the question arose, was Hunt sane? Was it not he who had stolen into my cabin in a fit of insanity? Of this I had no doubt, and murmured in my ear the words, "And Pym, poor Pym." Yes, and I had not been dreaming. In short, if all that Hunt had just said was true, if he was but the faithful reporter of secrets which had been entrusted to him by Dirk Peters, ought he to be believed when he repeated in a tone of mingled command and entreaty, "Pym is not dead, Pym is there, poor Pym must not be forsaken." When I had made an end of questioning Hunt, Captain Len Guy came out of his meditative mood, profoundly troubled, and gave the word, "All hands forward." When the men were assembled around him, he said, "Listen to me, Hunt, and seriously consider the gravity of the questions I am about to put to you." Hunt held his head up and ran his eyes over the crew of the Halbrane. "You assert, Hunt, that all you have told us concerning Arthur Pym is true?" "Yes." "You knew Dirk Peters?" "Yes." "You lived some years with him in Illinois?" "9 years." "And he often related these things to you?" "Yes." "And for your own part, you have no doubt that he told you the exact truth?" "None." "Well then, did it never occur to him that some of the crew of the Jane might have remained on Sowell Island?" "No." "He believed that William Guy and his companions must all have perished in the landslip of the Hill of Clock Clock?" "Yes, and from what he often repeated to me, Pym believed it also." "Where did you see Dirk Peters for the last time?" "At Vandalia." "How long ago?" "Over 2 years." "And which of you two was the first to leave Vandalia?" I thought I detected a slight hesitation in Hunt before he answered. "We left the place together." "You to go to?" "The Falklands." "And he?" "He," repeated Hunt. And then his wandering gaze fixed itself on Martin Holt, our sailing master, whose life he had saved at the risk of his own during the tempest. "Well," resumed the captain, "do you not understand what I am asking you?" "Yes." "Then answer me. When Dirk Peters left Illinois, did he finally give up America?" "Yes." "To go whither? Speak." "To the Falklands." "And where is he now?" "He stands before you."